Well, Wisconsin. Looks like your time has come. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails, host of Horrors, and today's episode features allegedly true and scary stories of the unexplained, like a story about a dogman sighted in Wisconsin, a UFO getting far too close, and a disturbing Japanese folklore monster stalking a village. Enjoy. Send us your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. Sign up to become a member at eriecast.com/plus for tons of bonus content, and follow and review Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts because it would make my day. Thank you. Now, let's begin. It followed me home. From Anonymous 13. It was a chilly December night. I was outside scraping the ice off my windshield and cursing under my breath. It was very dark out, and the parking lot of my job I worked at was pretty empty. I worked late that night, and most of my coworkers had already gone home. I'd agreed to stay a little later to help clean up before getting in my car for my 30-minute ride home. I was starting to regret my decision to stay so late. The roads around were looking a little icy, but not too bad. I figured I should be able to make my way home safely if I take it slow. I climbed inside my car and shut the door. As I reached for my seat, I felt this sudden rush of adrenaline. It felt like I was being watched. I ignored the feeling, tossing it up to the fact that I was just tired, and probably my mind was playing tricks on me. As I got myself buckled in, I turned on my car radio. I was flipping through the stations trying to find something good to listen to for the ride home when I reached a channel that was playing classic rock, but the reception was pretty bad and was very hard to hear. I began to turn the dial slowly when I heard it. A cracking and humming hiss that sounded unnatural. I listened a little longer and heard the faint sound of what sounded like two people having a conversation, but I couldn't make it out. As I was trying to listen in, I noticed all around my car was a pale green light. I stopped what I was doing immediately and started to look around. That humming sound was louder now, but it sounded like it was all around me. I turned off the radio and realized the sound was coming from outside. Curious and still feeling that rush of adrenaline, I decided to open the door up and have a look outside. At first, I didn't see anything unusual besides the green light, until I looked up. As my eyes adjusted to what I was looking at, I could hardly believe it. It was a UFO, not one of those cliché kinds you see in old movies. This was true to life and huge. It had green and yellow lights around its base and was circular in shape. I felt this ominous feeling deep in my stomach. As I slowly snapped out of my daze, I ran for my car as quick as I could. I grabbed the door handle, only to my horror to realize it was locked. I tried frantically to unlock it with my key, but no luck. I stared back at the UFO, and it started to hum louder. Then it shot off into the sky and disappeared. I stood there for a while in shock, trying to figure out what had just happened. After a while, I slowly made my way to the car door, hands shaking. I grabbed my key and tried once again to unlock the door. Thankfully, it unlocked this time, so I climbed inside and started my journey back home. I drove back home in silence, gripping the steering wheel. I was about 15 minutes away from my house when I started to get that feeling again. That feeling of being watched. I started to notice once again the pale green light, realizing it was back. And this time, it was following me. I sped up, trying to make it home as fast as I could. This UFO followed me all the way to the street where I lived. Once I started to pull into the driveway, I just realized I led it straight to my house. I sat in my car for a while, wondering if I should drive somewhere else and lead it away, when suddenly the craft flew off in a flash, disappearing once more I didn't waste any time. I got out of my car and booked it to my house. Once inside, I started to hyperventilate. I felt that rush of panic and I was still somewhat in shock. Did that really just happen to me? I wondered. I was tired. It had been a long night. Maybe I was losing it, but no, I couldn't have been hallucinating. There was just too many things that couldn't be explained that just happened. I remember the summer of 1992 like it was last week, though so much has changed since then. Back then, I had just turned 27, still feeling the afterglow of youth, but also aware that I needed to make some mature decisions if I wanted my life to stabilize. I was living in northern Illinois, not too far from the Wisconsin border, working as a traveling sales rep for a small office supply company. My job required me to spend hours on the road, visiting stores, and trying to convince managers to stock our pencils, paper, and staplers. It wasn't glamorous, but it covered my rent and gave me enough leftover cash for weekend outings with friends. That summer, the head office assigned me a new itinerary that stretched well into central Wisconsin. Rural territories, endless farmland, winding roads that cut through thick woods, and small towns miles apart from each other. Initially, I was excited about this change of scenery. I'd lived my whole life near the city. Getting to see rolling hills and forests of pine sounded refreshing. Plus, I'd be the only rep out there, which meant fewer competitors and a better chance of meeting quotas. One warm evening in late June, I packed my sky blue Ford Escort for a couple days on the road. I remember tossing a duffel bag into the trunk, alongside a giant black trash bag full of used clothes. I'd promised my aunt I'd drop them off at a Goodwill store upstate. She liked to declutter every few months and pass the load to me. "I'll get to it in my travels," I'd told her. But I'd already forgotten about the bag once, letting it sit in the trunk a week too long. By the time I finally left, it had a certain odor. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe an old pair of shoes or something that got damp. I figured I'd handle it soon enough and shrugged it off. That day, the sun was strong, lighting up the farmland in broad strokes of orange and gold. The roads twisted and turned, so I kept my windows down to take in the breeze. My cassette player was on full blast, Madonna, if memory serves, when I spotted a small sign for a country diner. I decided to stop for a quick meal. The place was nearly empty, and I felt a friendly warmth as the waitress served me meatloaf with mashed potatoes. I chatted a bit with an older couple about how quiet the region was, how traffic seemed non-existent. The man told me, half-jokingly, "We got more animals than people here. Just watch out for the big ones at night." I laughed politely and didn't think much of it. I left the diner around 7 p.m., hoping to reach my motel by nightfall. The route took me through an even lonelier stretch of highway. Trees loomed on both sides, casting long shadows as the sun dipped low. I was humming to myself, trying to keep calm because, despite the scenic view, I felt an undercurrent of unease. There was something about that dense forest that made me wonder how anyone could live so far removed from civilization. Not more than half an hour later, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. On the right side of the road, near the tree line, something big moved, an animal, perhaps. I slowed a bit, eyes scanning the darkness under the branches. For a moment, I spotted a form that looked vaguely canine but upright. It was tall, disturbingly tall for an animal on hind legs. My brain struggled to process it. Did I see a bear? A stray dog on two legs? The thing's eyes flashed in the waning light, and a chill ran up my spine. I pressed the accelerator, wanting to get far away from that spot. But after a few minutes, I glanced in my rearview mirror and realized I wasn't alone on this road anymore. Another silhouette, or maybe the same one, darted across the pavement behind me. It moved with uncanny speed, crossing from one side to the other and then vanishing into the shadows. My heart thudded. I told myself, keep driving, ignore the weird feelings. It's probably just an animal scurrying at dusk. Twilight turned into full night. The moon was out, though clouds passed over it periodically, blanketing the road in darkness. That's when I saw a shape emerge again, only this time it ran alongside my car, deeper into the woods, but parallel to my vehicle. I pressed my foot harder on the gas. My Escort wasn't a muscle car, but I got it up to around 60 miles per hour. The shape kept pace, weaving between trees. I could hear branches snapping, as though it was crashing through brush with a raw power that sent my pulse into overdrive. There was no mistaking it. Something very large was racing me from inside the forest. I'm not sure how long it continued. Maybe a few terrifying minutes, though it felt like hours. Eventually, the forest thinned, and a clearing came into view. The shape fell behind, swallowed by darkness, and I released a shaky breath. My palms were slick with sweat, my mind overwhelmed by questions. I tried to rationalize, maybe a wolf or coyote with an odd gait, but deep in my gut, I knew it was bigger, more upright, and more deliberate in its pursuit. I managed to spot a small gas station near a crossroads, all lit up by a flickering neon sign. I decided to pull in and calm my nerves. Inside, a teenage cashier blinked at me while I wiped sweat from my forehead and asked for directions. He warned me that beyond that crossroads, the next rest area was nearly an hour away, and there wouldn't be much in the way of civilization. I asked if he'd ever heard of any large animals roaming the woods. He shrugged, explaining that they get bears sometimes, but nothing else that big. I didn't push the subject, worried he'd think I was a city girl losing my mind. Leaving the station, I got back on the highway, determined to reach that next rest stop. The road was emptier than ever, with only occasional headlights in the opposite lane. At some point, I noticed a rancid smell creeping into the car. Realizing it had to be the bag of clothes in the trunk, I decided I'd ditch it at the rest stop if they had a dumpster. Maybe something inside was rotting. It certainly smelled that way. Sure enough, just before 10 p.m., I pulled into a lonely rest stop with a few vending machines, some battered picnic tables, and one lone street lamp flickering over the parking lot. My plan was simple. Get out, toss the trash bag, and maybe splash some water on my face. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I sensed movement. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of multiple shapes along the tree line, low to the ground, but unmistakably large. I froze, heart pounding. I hurried to the trunk, fumbling with my keys in the dark. As I opened it, the stench from the bag hit me in a wave of musty cloth, and who knows what else. That's when I heard them, heavy footfalls, one on each side, as if they were flanking me. I spun around, scanning the dimly lit area. For a second, I spotted two sets of eyes reflecting the orange glow of the street lamp. My throat went dry. I couldn't see them clearly, but the tall, dog-like figures crouched among the bushes had an unmistakable focus on me. A strangled gasp escaped my mouth. My entire body shook as I grabbed the black bag, hoisted it over my shoulder, and half stumbled toward the nearest trash bin. I could hear low growls, not like a typical dog's, but deeper and more resonant, almost echoing in my ears. My mind screamed at me to run, to throw the bag and get out of there, but my legs felt weighted down. Somehow, I managed to deposit the bag in the dumpster, slamming the lid shut. Almost instantly, the growling faded to a curious rumble, like they were sniffing the air. I realized with horror that the smell might have drawn them in. I sprinted back to my car, hands trembling. Before I could climb in, I heard scratching sounds on the pavement behind me. My eyes flicked around, spotting a tall outline under the street lamp. It had a canine snout, pointed ears, and muscular limbs that bent in an unnatural angle. Its fur shimmered dark, and I swear I saw sharp claws at the end of elongated fingers. I let out a scream, flung the driver's door open, and dove inside. My keys nearly slipped from my grip, but I managed to start the engine. As I reversed, my headlights swept across the parking lot. In that bright beam, I saw the creature lunge back into the shadows. It wasn't alone. Another one, nearly as large, retreated among the trees. 2 dogmen, or whatever they were, clearly hunting in tandem. Adrenaline shot through me like fire. In seconds, I was speeding down the highway again, ignoring every traffic law. For the next half hour, my mirror played tricks on me. At times, I caught glimpses of movement on the roadside. I kept imagining them charging out of the darkness, chasing my car with unnatural speed. The stench from the trunk was gone now that I'd disposed of the bag, but the memory of that reek lingered. Maybe it had drawn them in. Maybe they smelled something they wanted. I shook my head in disbelief at the thought. What exactly had my aunt packed up in that bag? Eventually, I reached a tiny motel near a small town. I checked in, dead-eyed and barely coherent. The night clerk gave me a concerned look, but didn't ask questions. Once in my room, I slid the chain lock and pushed a chair against the door for good measure, heart still hammering. I barely slept, half expecting to hear claws at the window. The following morning, sunlight helped me calm down enough to drive the rest of my route. I quietly decided to avoid any further rest stops unless absolutely necessary. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or how they managed to keep pace with me in the woods. But part of me is convinced those creatures, those dogmen, were drawn by the smell of something decaying in that trash bag. Whatever it was, I'm beyond grateful I disposed of it when I did. And I'll never forget the night I realized rural Wisconsin is home to more than just bears and farmland. Something else prowls those dark roads, and if you ever venture there, keep an eye on the tree line. I spent the summer of '99 living with a host family in rural Japan, halfway through a study abroad program designed to immerse me in language and culture. The village where I stayed was quiet. A patchwork of rice fields and dirt roads, with wooden houses that creaked in the wind. On my first day, my host sister Kiyomi told me we'd have fun exploring the old ways, though I assumed she just meant the local festivals and folklore. I had no idea how literal that would become. Kiyomi introduced me to 2 of her friends, Arisa and Daiichi, both curious about anything supernatural. They liked to swap ghost stories in hushed voices at the local tea house. One afternoon, Arisa mentioned a strange skeleton spirit that some villagers believed roamed the outskirts after midnight. She said it was called Gashadokuro, a massive skeleton yokai, born from the bones of people who died in famine or war, constantly hungry for human blood. I remember thinking it sounded like something out of a black and white horror movie. Daiichi joked about summoning it for a good scare, but Kiyomi shot him a warning look. She told us the old people in the village took Gashadokuro legends seriously, that it was best not to disturb anything we didn't fully understand. I shrugged off the story at first. Sure, I enjoyed the occasional spooky tale, but a giant skeleton demon didn't exactly fit into my day-to-day reality. My priority was to focus on improving my Japanese and not making a fool of myself. But a few evenings later, Arisa claimed her grandmother knew a secret ritual that could draw near any wandering yokai, specifically Gashadokuro. She insisted it was a harmless old superstition. Light a few candles, recite some lines, and wait. Daiichi teased me, saying if I was truly brave, I'd join them for the ritual. I let them rope me in, partly because I didn't want to look scared, partly because I was bored in a small town with little to do after dark. We headed out just past midnight, walking beyond the last row of houses until we hit the edge of a dried-up rice field. The wind rustled the reeds, and the moon gave everything a dull silver glow. Arisa unrolled a small cloth that contained her grandmother's instructions, a few lines of archaic script, plus a short chant. Kiyomi frowned the entire time, occasionally whispering that we shouldn't stay too long. I asked if she thought this was dangerous, but she told me she just felt uneasy performing some ritual that might offend the spirits. Daiichi read the lines of script out loud. I didn't catch everything. My Japanese wasn't perfect, but it sounded like an invitation or challenge to Gashadokuro, telling it to show itself if it was near. Arisa lit a pair of candles in shallow cups and spaced them a few feet apart in the dirt. I was asked to stand in the center with them, apparently to show I was the visitor. Kiyomi told me not to worry, that it was all just old folklore, but I noticed her hands shaking as she handed me a small branch. She said I should tap it twice against the ground to seal the invitation. It felt ridiculous, like some child's game. Still, I gave the branch 2 gentle taps on the dry earth. I wondered if I should say anything in English or Japanese to confirm my part in the ritual, but Daiichi just nodded. We waited, quiet except for the breeze rustling weeds around our ankles. 1 minute passed, then 2. Nothing. I exhaled in relief, started to grin at the silliness of it all. Then a chill crawled up my spine, a sudden drop in temperature that sent goosebumps across my arms. I asked if anyone else felt the cold, and Arisa murmured that she did, that the air felt charged. Kiyomi told me to hush for a moment. She wanted to listen for any sounds. Daiichi whispered that he heard something like faint rattling, but I couldn't hear it. We huddled close, scanning the horizon. Between the moonlit ridges of farmland, nothing looked out of place. Yet the sense of dread kept building, like we were being watched from somewhere out in the darkness. Arisa abruptly snuffed out the candles. She said we shouldn't call a yokai we didn't truly want to meet. Daiichi scoffed at her, but didn't complain. Everyone was tense, so we decided to pack up and head home. I walked with Kiyomi, who said we were probably just scaring ourselves. Her tone tried to sound reassuring, but she kept glancing over her shoulder, biting her lip whenever the wind rustled too loudly. We slept fitfully that night. Early the next morning, Arisa showed up looking pale. She told us she'd seen something giant moving across the field at dawn, like a huge skeletal outline against the light. She claimed it vanished in seconds, but it rattled her enough to come straight to us. I asked if she was sure it wasn't just a trick of the sunrise, but she insisted the shape looked like a bony frame as tall as the tree line. That made my stomach twist. I told her we couldn't have actually summoned anything, though a small part of me wasn't so certain. By sunset, rumors spread that a local farmer heard bizarre clanking noises near his barn and found footprints in the soil like oversized human prints. People whispered about Gashadokuro being stirred from slumber. Kiyomi was on edge, telling me we needed to avoid the fields at night. She mentioned the lore, that Gashadokuro hunts lone travelers, sneaks up silently, and bites their heads off to drink blood. Only survivors often described hearing a loud ringing in their ears just before the attack. I asked her if we'd be safe if we simply stayed indoors, and she said we should hope so, but that once Gashadokuro fixates on an area, it might wander for days before moving on. That second night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining a tall, grinning skeleton prowling the dark roads. Around 2 a.m., Kiyomi shook me awake. She told me there was a low rumble outside, like metal scraping. I crept to the window, peering through the slats. At first, I saw only moonlit fields. Then I noticed something in the distance. A faint glint of white, maybe 200 yards away, towering above the top of a small tool shed. My chest tightened. The silhouette shifted, and I realized it was too big to be a person, too angular to be an animal. I didn't see a full skeleton shape, but the ridges of bone were hinted at by pale moonlight. My stomach lurched. Kiyomi grabbed my arm. She told me we had to be absolutely silent, that Gashadokuro can detect movement and noise, and it might come closer if it sensed fresh prey. Her father, who was also awake, whispered that we'd messed with something best left alone. I wanted to apologize 100 times for going along with that silly ritual, but words wouldn't form. We stood by the window, watching the shape drift toward the next field. Even from that distance, I felt a heavy aura, like the air itself pressed on my lungs. Kiyomi breathed in shudders, telling me that if we heard a ringing in our ears, we had to hide or block our hearing with our hands, because that was the sign it was too close. The shape continued gliding across the farmland for several minutes, then slipped behind a grove of trees. We lost sight of it. Only then did I realize I'd been clenching my fists so hard my nails cut my palms. The next day, villagers whispered that something shattered a shed roof overnight. A few older folks were convinced Gashadokuro was roaming the outskirts, drawn by the memory of old battles or famine in that region. I asked one man if he thought there was a way to send it away, and he muttered about purification rites at a local shrine, though it had been decades since anyone performed them seriously. Arisa called me before sundown, her voice quivering. She told me we had a responsibility to undo what we'd done. I asked how we were supposed to achieve that, and she claimed her grandmother's notes mentioned an offering of food or drink at a certain shrine, along with a plea for mercy. Kiyomi insisted it was worth trying. I couldn't argue, given the alternative, letting a giant skeleton demon stalk us until it found a meal. So we gathered rice and salt, typical offerings in Shinto tradition, plus water in a large bottle. Under the late afternoon sun, we walked to the old shrine. The air smelled of cedar, and cicadas buzzed like an oppressive chorus. Arisa placed the rice and salt on a small wooden platform, then slowly poured water into a shallow bowl. We bowed, hands together, and she recited lines from her grandmother's script, something about letting the restless dead find peace. There was no dramatic flash of light, no thunderclap, but the quiet that followed felt strangely comforting, as though the weight in the air had lifted. That night I still felt nervous. I lay awake, ears straining for any trace of scraping metal or bone. Kiyomi dozed beside me, exhausted from the stress. For hours I heard nothing but the usual nocturnal hum of insects. Eventually I fell asleep. By morning the village was calm. No new stories about footprints or smashed roofs. Some folks joked about the crazy gaijin who believed in old skeleton ghosts, but I knew I saw something real. I left that village at the end of summer, carrying home more than language lessons. Even now I remember the looming outline of bones drifting across the night fields. Was it a trick of the moonlight? Maybe. But if you ask me, Gashadokuro is very much out there, a reminder that some dark stories aren't just stories. Even the friendliest little communities can hide ancient powers waiting to be stirred. And as for me, I learned never to tempt the unknown with a careless ritual. If you ever find yourself in the Japanese countryside, Watch what you summon. You might not be able to send it back so easily. South African Shapeshifter. From T. Fren. I live in South Africa. This experience happened when my friend Thule offered me a gig. I would be spending a single night in Limpopo province. Apparently, I would be assisting her uncle with wildlife surveys near the Soutpansberg Mountains. I'd been cooped up in Pretoria for too long, so I jumped at the chance for some fresh air. A few days later, we were on a bumpy dirt road, surrounded by golden grass and scrubby trees. The plan was simple. We'd stay at her uncle's place, help count kudu or impala, document their grazing spots, and then do nothing in the evenings but eat, talk, and fall asleep, to the sounds of jackals calling in the distance. It sounded almost therapeutic. On the second night, a neighbor dropped by with stories about poachers. He said some nights you'd see suspicious lights near the bush. Other times you'd wake to find fresh tracks that didn't match any known animal. I asked if it could be a leopard, maybe a hyena. He just shook his head, replying that this was something else. Maybe someone with dark medicine. Thule later explained that people around here sometimes mentioned shapeshifters, humans who could take on the form of beasts under the right circumstances. I didn't put much stock into it. It felt like a leftover folktale, the kind you'd hear around a fire. The next day, Uncle Jabu, that's what we called him, insisted that we set out early to check a watering hole. He said the place had been disturbed overnight, and he wanted photos for his wildlife log. Thule stayed behind. She'd caught a bad cold, so it was just me and him, driving a dusty pickup down a narrow track. We pulled up to find footprints in the mud, large and oddly shaped, almost like a big cat's but a bit off. Jabu took pictures, then pointed out that some impressions looked like a barefoot human had stepped right next to or on top of the cat tracks. He told me about a local legend, the Lion Man, or sometimes referred to as the Leopard Man. Depends on the stories and who told them. Well, he was said to roam these hills. People claimed it was a witch or a cursed individual who could shift forms. Sure, it sounded wild, but Jabu was dead serious. He believed in that stuff, said he'd seen strange things over the years, animals that vanished without a trace, or a man spotted sprinting on all fours with unnatural speed. I tried to stay open-minded, even though my rational brain screamed it had to be a normal lion or some sort of illusion. We spent the afternoon collecting data. We snapped pictures of fresh scat and broken tree branches. A short rain shower hit us out of nowhere, so we hurried back to the house. The muddy road made for slow driving, but we arrived just before sunset. Thule was feeling better and teased me about looking so spooked. I admitted the footprints were weird. She nodded and said that sometimes the stories have roots in real experiences. That evening, we sat around the fire pit outside. The night sky was huge and shimmering with stars. No city lights, no traffic, just the crackle of flames. Jabu roasted some mealie bread and told us more about the local shapeshifter lore. I listened closely and politely. He described how, in certain families, the ability is said to get passed down. A secret taught by older relatives, adept in witchcraft. They supposedly used animal skins or special rituals. My mind wandered, imagining a person draped in a lion's pelt and stalking through the bush. It sounded like a myth, and yet there was something in Jabu's voice that made it feel uncomfortably real. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. I climbed into my makeshift bedroom, a converted storage room with a small window overlooking the yard. The frogs and crickets outside were louder than I'd ever heard in the city, but I found the chorus soothing. After an hour or two, I must have drifted off. I woke suddenly to a noise just outside my window, a low growl, almost a rumble. At first, I assumed it was a far-off lion or maybe a big dog. Then it got closer, all throaty and wet, like a big animal clearing its throat. My pulse quickened. In that moment, I remembered the footprints. I reached over and flipped on a small lamp. The window was open a crack, letting in a cool breeze. Carefully, I got up and peered outside. In the faint moonlight, I saw a shape near the edge of the yard, beyond a patch of tall grass. It had a cat-like outline, lean body, powerful shoulders, but it stood in a strange half-crouch, almost as if it were trying to balance upright. I thought my heart was going to stop. Part of me wanted to assume it was just a lion or some sort of big leopard. But the angles were not right. It was bigger than any leopard I'd seen, and the limbs were too awkward, too long. I felt a jolt of terror. Suddenly, the shape's head snapped up, and I glimpsed what looked like a face caught between human and feline features. The eyes glowed a bit, and I could have sworn there was a flash of pale skin where fur was. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, exhaled, and tried to think rationally. Maybe I was half dreaming. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks. But then it moved. Slow, deliberate steps toward the house, each one more creepy than the last. I choked on my own breath. It paused by a half-broken fence post. For a second, it sounded like it was sniffing the air. I had no clue what to do. Close the window, wake up Jabu, or just stand there in numb panic. I heard a faint scraping, as if claws were scratching wood. Then it backed away, hunching over, and with a short leap, it disappeared behind a cluster of rocks. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I told Thule what I saw, or at least what I thought I saw. She looked alarmed, said it matched the old Shapeshifter stories she had heard. Supposedly, a lion witch or lion man had been rumored to roam these parts for decades. Some locals even believed it was an actual lion, possessed by a witch's magic. Others said it was a person who could physically shift forms under the right moon phase, as the other legends I mentioned spoke. Jabu listened quietly, telling me to stick close to the house after sundown. We spent the morning circling the yard. Indeed, we found odd tracks near the fence post. Huge paw prints again, but the back portion looked almost human. I felt goosebumps. That afternoon, I accompanied Thule to a local shop to buy supplies. When she casually mentioned the Lion Man sightings to the shopkeeper, the old woman behind the counter frowned and told us we shouldn't speak of such cursed things. She said it was an ancient affliction. Some families lost members to it. Said once you shapeshift too many times, you lose your human side. I asked her how to stay safe. She said that one should carry certain herbs for protection, or scatter them around the house. She refused to elaborate further and hurried us out. Back at the property, I helped Jabu gather branches for a stronger fence. The day was hot, the heat was relentless, but I welcomed the busy work. Anything to distract me from replaying last night's scene in my head. I kept checking the horizon, just making sure I didn't see a familiar shape. Luckily, for now, all I saw were birds. As evening approached, Thule and Jabu sprinkled a mix of crushed herbs near every doorway and window. I ate dinner with them, but I barely tasted the food. I was so on edge. Around 10 p.m., Jabu suggested we all sleep in the main area, basically turning the living room into a shared space. We rolled out blankets, locked the doors, lit a small lantern, and tried to relax. The house felt safer than my little storage room. We listened to the night creatures outside, crickets chirping and geckos clicking on the walls. I dozed off eventually. Sometime past midnight, a faint thud woke us all up. We shot up, glancing at each other in the lantern's glow. Another thud followed, like something testing the walls. Jabu signaled for us to keep quiet. For a very long time, it felt like we sat there tense in silence. Then there was a grunt, low and breathy, right outside the door. Thule gripped my arm. I could feel her trembling. Eventually, the sounds stopped. No scrapes, no growls, no footfalls. The wind picked up then, causing the corrugated metal roof to rattle. Jabu had us wait another hour before we all dared to breathe easy again. None of us slept very well, but at least there was no direct confrontation. At sunrise, we went outside. The dust near the front step had been scattered a bit. We found bizarre prints there. Prints that looked like cat paws, and I swear I remember them transitioning into the shape of human feet. They overlapped at one point. Jabu's face went grim. He admitted he'd always heard stories of these shapeshifters, but he never thought it'd hit so close to home. We spent one final day there, cleaning up the yard and double-checking the fences, laying out even more herbs. Then Thule and I headed back to Pretoria. To this day, I still feel as though we'd brushed against something far beyond rational explanation. Even now, years later, I can't forget the image of that silhouette in the moonlight. It looked very much half cat and half human, a presence that felt both powerful and deeply wrong. If you ever met me and asked me if I believed in shapeshifters, I would usually try to evade the question. Truth is, I'm not completely certain what I saw. Maybe it was a real lion or cat of some sort, and the angle I saw it at made me see it a bit differently. Or maybe I'm just trying to cope with a very bizarre experience. That's Not My Mom, and Weird Noises. From Anonymous. I've always been interested in mysteries about Bigfoot, skinwalkers, ghosts, and the whole bunch. I've never really had any paranormal experiences except for these. In my home, there's a long hallway with a bathroom, my room, my sister's room, and my mom's room at the end of the hallway. This happened when I was 8 years old. I was in my room. I think it was around 8 o'clock. I was getting ready for bed. In my family, we always say goodnight to each other, and I still needed to say goodnight to one of my moms. My bedroom door was open, and so was my sister's. My sister had these fairy lights, and they were purple, shining into the hallway. I was looking through my door into the hallway, and I saw my mom walk by. My mom has these gray pajamas that match, and she was wearing them that night. I saw her walk by into her room, and I went to say goodnight. As I exited my room and looked into my mom's room, it was pitch black. There were no lights on, and back then, they would always turn the lights on when they went into their room. That's strange, I thought to myself. I don't exactly remember if I went in their room or not, but if I did, I didn't see anything or anyone. Freaked out, I went downstairs to ask my other mom if the mom in the gray pajamas went to bed already. When I got down there, both of them were there, just sitting and watching a show on the TV. So it isn't confusing. The mom that I thought I saw was Mom 1. The one I asked about her would be Mom 2. I asked Mom 1 if she was upstairs, and she said no, that they've been down here with Mom 2 the whole time. Confused, I told them what I saw. I don't know if they believed me or not, but after that, I went to bed. Now, could I have been tired? Possibly. But I remember I heard the footsteps. It was affected by the purple light coming out of my sister's room. It had looked exactly like my mom. Same hair, same clothes, same everything. A few years later, I brought this story up again to Mom too. She said, "Oh, I think that was me. I was bringing some of your sister's laundry to her room." This might make sense, but I know what I saw. I saw her not holding a single thing, walking into her room. To make it worse, Mom 1 and 2 don't look at all alike. The one I saw is about 5'6" with brown and curly hair. Mom 2 is probably around 5'3"-ish, black straight hair and glasses. Couldn't have been her. To this day, I don't know what I saw, whether it was a ghost or something else. Doubt I'll ever know. Story 2. I was sitting in a chair in our breakfast nook, late at night. Everyone else was in bed, so it was just me. Without warning, I heard something hit the house outside where I was sitting. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but then maybe a few weeks after that it happened again, also late at night. I was playing a VR game with 2 of my friends, and I heard something hit the house. It wasn't near the breakfast nook like last time. It was at the living room where I was. A month or 2 after that, it was also at night, and I was heading up to my room to chill for a bit. As I was going up the stairs, I heard something. Not something hitting the house, but something whistling from outside around my neighbor's yard. A full-blown whistle, human-sounding. I live in southern Maine, nowhere near Navajo land, but I still thought about those stories of skinwalkers. Heck, maybe they migrate. These may not have been the craziest or scariest experiences, but they're the strangest things I've ever encountered. The following 2 stories are members-only contest-winning stories from our EerieCast Plus membership. The first one is Quarantine Walk Home from Goudetsidis. It was a cold night during the COVID quarantine. I was hanging out with some new friends some ways away from my home. I live in a village 7 kilometers from the city, and there's only one bus line that goes to my village. The quarantine was very strict. We had curfew and limited time outside, so my parents didn't like me hanging out at all, but didn't stop me. We hung out, had fun, and now it was time to go home. Me and another guy took the same bus that I haven't taken before, and he got off earlier but told me where and when to get off and where to go, so I'd be fine. A little bit sketchy, not gonna lie, but I managed. From there, I found familiar ground and went to my bus stop, which was really sketchy, and everyone in my village knows this bus stop. It's close to a notorious neighborhood where all the drug dealers live. I get to my bus stop, a lonely road with no one around, just the breeze and the buildings. It's 9 o'clock, which is the curfew. I have no mobile data, so I called my friend and asked him to check when there's a bus at my stop. He asked me which route, arrival or return. I said return and he checked the app. He said it would be there in 5 minutes. Great. 5 minutes pass, and the bus comes from the other direction. Panicked and confused, I begin to wonder if it's the right one. Maybe it was just a coincidence that it was arriving around the same time. But it wasn't. Return is when the bus goes to the city. I wanted to go to the village, so arrival is the route I was taking. When I figured it out, I panicked even more. What do? I have to get home. And then, all the lights went out everywhere. And I mean no streetlights, no lights from buildings, no lights at all, just the moon. I spun my head around to check all directions, and in seconds after the blackout, headlights light up. But it wasn't from the road coming up. It was like a car was there on the road, and it lit the headlights right at me. I turned around in an instant, but there was nothing. The headlights lit the road, and I thought it must be from a truck, but I couldn't see any vehicle. Surely it must be around the bend, I thought. I waited, but no vehicle came around the corner. I hear a noise. It had to be the truck. But what is this timing? It's like a movie scene from Christine. It was terrifying. I started to back up. I had to get home, and with no buses, I couldn't. I started to walk, panicked and now terrified. I knew the road, but my home was 5 kilometers away from that bus stop. I started to walk, checking behind me to see if something was coming or if those lights moved. Then some dogs came from nowhere, barking, startling me, and coming towards me. I took a stone for protection and walked around them. 100 more meters and I see some cars, finally. I tried to hitchhike, but no one stopped for me. I continued to walk, reaching a gas station, and asked if someone could drive me home, explaining my situation. A dude said he had to walk 5 kilometers the other way and left me. I started to walk again, nearly in tears at this point. I must have walked 1 kilometer in that time, and from the fear, the exhaustion, and the cold, my legs were trembling. I had to go 4 more kilometers, and my condition was worsening with each step I took. I knew that when I got home, I was getting scolded like no other time, but I couldn't tell them where I went and what happened. Once I made it to the shops with junkyards around the buildings filled with truck cabins stacked on top of one another like Tetris, I shivered. I thought, this can't be happening right now. The sight of broken trucks under the moonlight was a horror show on its own. There were roads ahead on my 2 sides, trucks and fences with dogs barking at me, and I dared not look back to see the road behind. If I did, I was afraid that ghost truck would light up its lights again, and I might just die on the spot. I walked and jogged, but I didn't run. I didn't want to, not wanting to provoke the phantom truck or anything else. When I finally passed the mechanic shops, I could breathe a bit easier, but I still had about 2 kilometers ahead of me. I began to jog faster, passing random businesses. I didn't care anymore. It was my last push. I thought now that if I passed the junkyards, that truck wouldn't have power over me anymore. But when I reached my top speed, I saw lights flash again. I froze on the spot and didn't move an inch. After a couple of seconds, a car passed by. I shouted and flared my hands, but he didn't stop. Didn't even brake a little bit, just went on and took the corner. As I looked at the car, I saw light, as if there were street lights that worked. That moment, as the realization hit me that after the turn there was my salvation, there were more flashing lights. I snapped back again, but nothing was there somehow. I exploded into a full-blown sprint. I used all my willpower, all my energy, to be as fast as I could. I ran faster than I probably ever did in my life. I turned around the corner, seeing the lights gradually light up my view, but I pushed on, running and laughing and smiling like crazy. I finally made it. My phone rang. I picked up. My mom was screaming at me.
"Where are you? Why didn't you pick up your phone?"
I then realized that I had no reception the entire time, which didn't make any sense. I told her, "I'm coming home. I'm almost there." I jogged the rest of the way back, and when I entered the residential area, I let out a big sigh. As I breathed in and filled my lungs with some warm air, I readied myself for the scolding I was about to get. I entered my home. My family was in the living room, and they gave me angry glances. My dad motioned me to sit on the couch. I did, and I took all the scolding by looking at the floor and saying, "You're right," over and over again. When it was over, I went to my room. But how could I sleep with all this on my mind? How could I tell my parents that I went out of the village, and kind of too far, where I shouldn't have even gone out in the first place? How could I tell them I was chased by a phantom truck? I cried my way to sleep. I kept my composure all the same, but when I hugged my pillow under the covers, under the protection of my house and parents, I let it all out. This was the scariest moment of my life. I'm always wary around that bus stop at nights, for if the lights go out on me and I get flashed again, I think it might be back for me. It moved in the shadows. From Karma C. We were driving home late one night, and we'd made it to within a country mile of the house. If you could cut through the forest, it was more like half a mile. But as it was, we had a little longer to drive. It was always dark on our road, as it was a very small road, closely guarded by towering trees and overgrown weeds. The moonlight barely cut through, even with the bare trees. We had the high beams on to help illuminate the road. The risk of hitting a wild animal was high, due to the lack of civilization for miles around. We were rounding a sharp bend in the road when we both saw a large shadow coming from the woods to our right. Whatever it was huge and stayed in the shadows just beyond our headlights. It was running on 2 legs, but it wasn't bouncing like a human would. It was really odd. We were both immediately freaked out because we knew it couldn't be a person and had no clue what we just witnessed. It happened so fast, but seemed to take forever to get far enough away that we weren't scared anymore. Living where we did our whole lives had made us more comfortable in and around the woods. We knew the area, we knew the wildlife, and we knew what we just saw did not belong here. Neither of us knew why we felt afraid at the time. We weren't in any danger, so to speak. Just witnessed what we later decided had to be Bigfoot. The way it stayed in the shadows, the way it moved, the size of it was unbelievable. The lights never fully illuminated it, but it was a dark color, based on where it came out of the woods. We determined that it had to be at least 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall. What stuck in my mind the most was how wide it was. Its shoulders were just so wide it was really scary. I can't explain to this day exactly what it was, with certainty, but I'm pretty sure Bigfoot played chicken with us that night. I know there are other cryptids in and around that area. There have been sightings of Dogman or werewolves, so, again, I'm not able to say for sure what we saw. I can, however, say certainly that it wasn't human, or a local wild animal either. My apologies, Wisconsin. I hope you can manage your Dogman problem. That brings us to the end of this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. Join me on X at Dark Prevails for updates in between episodes and more. Buy some cool merch at eriecast.store. Support us and get lots of bonus content by becoming a member at eriecast.com/plus. And help us become the biggest horror podcast in the world by following and reviewing Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.